She was marked unworthy, but he called her his greatest prize. The rain fell in sheets against the worn stone of Ashford Estate, and Margaret pressed her forehead against the cold kitchen window, watching the garden she would never tend dissolve into grey mist. She had lived within these walls for 17 years, first as the beloved daughter of the estate's steward, and for the last 5 as the kitchen scullion. No one simply became a scullion. It required a spectacular fall. The scandal had been absolute. Her father, trusted by the previous Lord Ashford for 2 decades, discovered embezzling funds. Margaret would never forget the day the magistrate came. She would never forget her mother weeping, or her father's face as he looked at her. Not with love, but with the terrible knowledge that he had destroyed her future. The new Lord Ashford, having just inherited, could have been merciful. Instead, he had been practical. The steward's family would leave, he declared, but Margaret would remain as a scullion. Perhaps the shame of the position would serve as penance for her father's crimes. Perhaps it would deter others from considering theft. That had been 5 years ago. Margaret was now 23, her hands rough from lye soap and scalding water, her back permanently curved from bending over cooking fires. Her beauty, and it had been remarkable once, had faded into something forgettable. The kitchen maid sometimes forgot her name entirely, calling out, "You there?" or "Girl," without malice, simply because she had become as much a fixture as the hearth itself. She had never seen the new Lord Ashford since the day of her sentencing. The estate was large, and he rarely ventured into the kitchen. Rumors about him were plentiful. He was cold, they said, a man who had arrived at his title already hardened. He rarely attended the village assemblies. He took his meals alone in the library. He had refused 3 advantageous matches, each rejection more mysterious than the last. The autumn morning that changed everything began like any other. Margaret was preparing the servants' breakfast, her hands automatically moving through the routine. Stir the porridge, warm the milk, slice the bread, when Mrs. Dunlap, the head cook, burst into the kitchen with urgent news. "He's bringing guests," the woman announced breathlessly. "Lord Ashford's bringing visitors for a month-long house party. Nobility from London. We're to prepare the East Wing, and we need enough food for a king's ransom. Margaret, stop your daydreaming and pay attention. We'll be needing additional hands, and you're to help with the preservation work. Every vegetable, every preserved fruit, every recipe must be perfect." Margaret's heart sank. A month of even harder labor, of waking before dawn and working past midnight. But it was not her place to complain. It was her place to work and to be grateful that she had work to do it all. The preparations were exhausting. Margaret found herself sent to the root cellar to organize supplies, then to the still room to prepare the herbs for storage, then to the kitchen gardens to gather the last of the autumn vegetables. She was everywhere and nowhere, visible only when her labor was needed. It was during one of these tasks, standing on a ladder in the pantry, arranging preserves on the highest shelf, that she first heard him speak to her directly. "You're in my light." Margaret nearly dropped an entire jar of damson jam in her shock. She scrambled down the ladder to find the new Lord Ashford standing in the doorway. She had seen him only in the distance, usually astride his horse or crossing the grounds toward the house. Close proximity was startling. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with dark hair and dark eyes that contained something that looked remarkably like anger. But there was something else too. Something lonely in the set of his shoulders, something that suggested he carried a weight that existed only in his mind. "Forgive me, my lord," Margaret stammered, pressing herself against the wall to give him passage. She kept her eyes down, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance, her work-stained dress, the flour dust in her hair. He paused. She felt his gaze move across her, and she braced herself for the inevitable moment of revulsion that always came when nobility truly looked at the lower servants. Instead, there was only silence. Then, "You're efficient, at least. I've observed you moving through the house. You don't waste motion." It was perhaps the strangest compliment she had ever received, and she didn't know how to respond to it. By the time she managed to form a reply, he had already moved past her into the pantry. The arrival of the guests 2 days later transformed Ashford Estate. The grand carriage rolled up the drive bearing Lord and Lady Richmond and their daughter, along with a second carriage containing Lord Ashford's closest friend from Cambridge, the Earl of Worthington, and his younger sister, Lady Sophia. A third carriage arrived the following day with additional guests, a mixture of unmarried women and eligible gentlemen, all laughing and animated in the way that spoke of easy wealth and assured futures. Margaret saw them only in glimpses. Once, while serving at the formal dinner, she witnessed the radiant face of Miss Richmond as she gazed at Lord Ashford across the candlelit table. He did not gaze back. Once, while delivering fresh linens to the guest chambers, she heard Lady Sophia discussing the situation with Mrs. Dunlap in hushed, conspiratorial tones. Everyone in London believes he's either grieving a lost love or harboring some dreadful secret. Do you think he's mad? He's quite handsome when he forgets to scowl. It would be a shame if he were mad. The formal events, the dinners, the musicale, the card games, were where Margaret glimpsed the lives of the guests. But it was in the early mornings that she saw something different. She had taken to rising before anyone else, gathering kindling for the kitchen fire, and occasionally she would notice him. Lord Ashford, alone in the library or walking the grounds before dawn, looking like a man who hadn't slept. Once, she found him sitting by the fountain in the garden at 5 in the morning, his expression dark and fixed on something she couldn't see. It was during the second week of the house party that the terrible incident occurred. Margaret was in the wine cellar, fetching bottles for the evening's dinner, when she heard shouting from above. She hurried upstairs to find chaos in the kitchen. One of the guest rooms had been broken into, Lady Richmond's jewels stolen, along with a substantial sum of cash that had been left on the dressing table. The theft sent shockwaves through the household. Lord Ashford called a gathering of all staff in the great hall. His face was like stone as he stood before them, his dark eyes moving from servant to servant with what Margaret recognized as bitter confirmation of some previously held belief. "A thief walks among you," he said coldly. "Someone in this house, someone I have employed or trusted, has repaid that trust with betrayal. The stolen items will be recovered, and the guilty party will face the magistrate. Unless, of course, the items are returned within 24 hours. In that case, the thief will be dismissed without reference, and I will merely ensure they never find employment in this county again. That is my final offer." The gathering dispersed in whispers and anxious conversations. Margaret felt the weight of suspicion in the air. Suspicion that always fell, in cases like these, upon the lowest servants, upon those who had the least to lose and the most visible desperation. She was returning to her small attic room late that evening when she heard the commotion. Guards were searching the servants' quarters. She watched as one of the junior footmen, a lad named Thomas who had recently arrived from the village, was dragged toward the great hall. His face was white, and he was denying everything, but the stolen brooch had been found in his mattress. Margaret's stomach twisted. She had spoken to Thomas only once, had merely offered him an extra potato during a dinner service, but she recognized the look on his face. The look of a young man watching his life collapse in an instant. The trial before the magistrate was scheduled for 3 days hence. Thomas would hang. That was the probable outcome, and everyone knew it. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept thinking of her own father, of how quickly ruin could come, of how a single terrible choice or terrible circumstance could destroy everything. She thought of Thomas, barely 20, making a decision born of desperation, and now facing a noose. She was awake when she heard the footsteps in the hall outside her room. One set of footsteps, moving slowly past each servant's door, then pausing. After a moment they retreated. It came to her suddenly, as if illuminated by a lightning strike. Someone was searching the servants' quarters in the darkness, and that someone was of sufficient rank that no one would dare stop them. Margaret pulled on her shawl and crept from her room. She followed the sound of the footsteps and found herself in the main corridor, where she came face to face with Lord Ashford. He was holding a leather bag, and his expression was one of grim fury. She opened her mouth to scream, to call for help, to do whatever one did when confronted with one's employer conducting a secret search in the dead of night. Instead, she said, It wasn't him. Lord Ashford went very still. Excuse me? The footman. Thomas. He didn't steal the jewels. Margaret's voice was steady, though her heart was hammering. He wouldn't. He's frightened of Lady Richmond. She once threw a glove at him for bringing the wrong tea service. He would never dare enter her room. And how would a scullion maid know such details about the character of a junior footman? His tone was dangerous. Margaret hesitated. The truth was, she had spent 5 years making herself invisible, and invisible people saw everything. They heard conversations not meant for them, observed patterns that others missed, understood the hierarchies and fears of the household in ways that those with proper roles never could. Because people don't see us, she said finally. Because we watch. Lord Ashford's expression shifted. Something that might have been respect flickered across his features, or perhaps it was simply recognition. He opened the leather bag, and Margaret saw the gleam of Lady Richmond's jewels inside. The lady's own son, Lord Ashford said quietly, sent money, desperate money, to cover debts from gambling. When his mother discovered what he'd done, she sent word that if I pressed charges, she would ensure I never saw a seat in Parliament, never married, never recovered the social position my family had lost before I inherited. She's a formidable woman. I was going to allow Thomas to hang to preserve my own future. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. Not sympathy for him. His pain was his own making, but understanding. This was a man who had already condemned himself, and the weight of that condemnation was what kept him awake at dawn, walking in the mist. "What will you do?" she asked. "I don't know," he said, and the admission seemed to cost him. "Help me. Tell me what a person with nothing to lose would do in this situation." Margaret thought of her father, rotting in a cottage on the edge of the village, his reputation destroyed. She thought of the alternative paths her life might have taken if mercy had been offered instead of punishment. "You return the jewels anonymously," she said. "You tell the magistrate that upon further investigation, there is insufficient evidence for trial. You release Thomas and provide him a reference letter under another name so he can seek work elsewhere. And you find a way to separate yourself from Lady Richmond's threats without allowing an innocent boy to hang. She'll call in her debts. She'll ensure I'm isolated, that no respectable woman marries me, that I become a pariah." "You're already a pariah," Margaret said gently. "At least this way you'll be one with a conscience." He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment Margaret saw something shift. A man who had been bound by fear and social obligation suddenly glimpsed a path to freedom, and it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "What's your name?" he asked. "Margaret, my lord. Margaret Hensworth, the steward's daughter." His voice was different now, not contemptuous but something like realization. "The one whose father—" "Yes, my lord." He set down the bag carefully on a side table. "And how have you borne it? 5 years of my silent judgment? Because that's what this has been. Punishment by association. Because your father's crime was against my interests." Margaret felt tears prickling her eyes, but she held them back. She had learned long ago that crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I survived," she said simply, "as one does." The next morning, Lord Ashford sent for the magistrate. He explained that upon further investigation, he believed his guests were mistaken about the timing of the theft. Perhaps the jewels had been mislaid. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. In any case, there was insufficient evidence to proceed. Thomas was released, given a glowing reference letter, and disappeared from Ashford Estate by midday. Lady Richmond arrived in the drawing room with fury written across her face. Margaret, serving tea, heard the confrontation through the half-open door. "You're making a grave mistake," the lady hissed. "I will ensure your ruin. I have connections throughout the ton. No woman of any family will even look at you." "I am aware," Lord Ashford said calmly. "However, I find I'm no longer concerned with the approval of women who would sacrifice an innocent boy to their own convenience. Please feel free to blacken my name in every drawing room from here to Edinburgh. I suspect I'll survive it." The Richmounts left Ashford Estate that very afternoon, and their departure seemed to take with it the last constraint that had been binding Lord Ashford to his carefully constructed isolation. The remaining guests noticed the change. He began appearing at meals with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. He attended the musicale and actually listened rather than scowling from the shadows. He spent time in conversation with the Earl of Worthington that looked almost like genuine affection. And he began appearing in places where Margaret was working. Not obviously. Not in a way that would cause scandal or comment. But she would be organizing the larder and find him standing in the doorway, asking about the preservation methods for winter vegetables. She would be mending a worn apron in the servants' hall, and he would sit across from her, looking at books as if that explained his presence. She would be gathering herbs in the still room, and he would ask her opinion about which ones were best suited for different purposes. It was on the third such visit that he actually began to speak. "Do you hate me?" he asked. He was sitting at the wooden table in the still room, watching her arrange dried rosemary and thyme into cloth bundles. "No, my lord," Margaret said. It was the truth, surprising even to herself. "You were cruel, yes, but cruelty born of fear is not the same as cruelty born of malice. I recognized the fear. I've lived with fear for 5 years. I wonder," he said slowly, "what my life might have been like if I had possessed your grace from the beginning, if I had understood that fear is a poor master." Margaret set down a bundle of herbs with careful precision. "Your life isn't over. The guests will leave soon. You'll remain." "I'll remain," he agreed, "but I'll remain diminished. I've destroyed any chance of a respectable marriage. I've ensured my own isolation." "No," Margaret said. She turned to face him fully, meeting his eyes for the first time without deference or fear. "You've ensured your own freedom. There's a difference." The house party ended on a blustery October afternoon. The guests departed in a flurry of carriages and promises to correspond that everyone knew would not be kept. The Earl of Worthington left last, lingering to embrace Lord Ashford with a warmth that suggested deep affection and possibly deep concern. "Whatever you're doing, do it carefully," the Earl murmured, and Margaret, passing through the great hall with linens, caught only his warning tone and nothing more. When the house had emptied and returned to its normal rhythms, Margaret expected to see less of Lord Ashford. Instead, she saw him more. He began taking his meals in the kitchen, an action that scandalized Mrs. Dunlap but which no one dared to question. He would sit at the servants' table and listen to the conversations of the staff with genuine interest, asking questions about their families, their concerns, their lives. The other servants whispered about it constantly. What did it mean? Was he mad after all? Was he planning something? But slowly, imperceptibly, the whispers changed. The servants began to bring him their problems. A maid whose elderly mother was dying would find medicines mysteriously appearing at the cottage. A groundskeeper with an injured son would discover that his wages had been increased. Acts of quiet, practical kindness, administered without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. Margaret watched this transformation with something like wonder. She also watched the danger it posed. Ashford Estate was not far from the village of Thornfield, and villages had eyes. It was inevitable that rumors would begin to spread about the new lord, about his strange behavior, about the fact that he never attended church, never appeared at social functions, and spent his time consorting with servants. The vicar took it upon himself to pay a visit one crisp November morning. Margaret was in the kitchen when she heard their voices in the study. The vicar's tone was stern and patronizing, the tone of a man convinced of his moral superiority. "My lord, I have come to speak to you about the state of your soul. The parishioners are concerned. Your behavior is not that of a Christian gentleman. You work in the kitchen alongside servants. You have cut yourself off from decent society. Some are beginning to wonder if you are possessed of an unsound mind." There was a pause, and then Lord Ashford's voice, calm and clear. "Tell the parishioners that I am precisely where I wish to be, engaged in the work I believe to be worthwhile. Should they be concerned with my soul, the most effective thing they can do is examine their own." The vicar left in a state of high indignation, and his sermon the following Sunday was all about the corruption that comes from abandoning one's proper station. accompanied by heavy implications and significant looks directed toward the empty pew that Lord Ashford usually occupied. But that had been the last attempt to manage him socially. It seemed that once he accepted his own diminishment, there was nothing left for society to threaten him with. As winter approached, Margaret found herself in a curious position. She was no longer quite a scullion, though her title had not officially changed. She was somehow essential to the running of the household in ways that transcended normal position. She took her meals with the other household staff, but there was often a seat left empty beside her, and once, when she was ill with a winter ague, the man who sat in it walked into her tiny attic room and left beef broth warming by the fire. In December, on a day of hard frost that painted the windows with intricate crystals of ice, Lord Ashford found her in the kitchen gardens. She was attempting to gather the last of the root vegetables before the ground froze solid, and she was badly managing with numb fingers and a willpower that was beginning to fray. He took the spade from her hands and finished the work himself, his fingers turning blue but his jaw set with determination. When they had filled 2 baskets with turnips and parsnips, he led her to the small stone cottage that served as the groundskeeper's storage shed. "Sit," he commanded, and she sat, collapsing onto a wooden bench because her legs were shaking from cold and fatigue. He knelt in front of her and took her frozen hands between his own. For several minutes he simply held them, warming them, not speaking. When she could feel her fingers again, he said quietly, "I have been a coward. 5 years. I let you suffer to ease my own conscience. I believed that if I allowed your father's punishment to stand, if I allowed you to be diminished, it somehow made my own position more secure. Didn't. It only made me smaller as a person. Lord Ashford. My name is Adrian," he said. "I would very much like for you to call me by it." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. What he was proposing, what his tone suggested he was proposing, was impossible. A man of his station did not court a woman of hers. A man of his station did not risk his reputation, his future. The winter passed in a strange, muted joy. No one spoke of marriage. It was impossible, scandalous, would be mocked in every drawing room from London to Edinburgh. But Adrian stopped attending to most of the business of the estate, delegating responsibilities to competent managers, and instead he spent hours in the kitchen, in the gardens, in the still room. He read to her while she worked. He brought her books so she could continue her education. He asked her opinions about everything, about philosophy, about art, about the world beyond Ashford Estate. Mrs. Dunlap noticed, of course. The head cook had been with the family for 30 years, and she was a woman of considerable wisdom and very little judgment about matters of the heart. "He loves you," she said one afternoon, as simply as if she were commenting on the weather. "I've seen love before. That's love." "It doesn't matter," Margaret replied, but her hands trembled as she spoke. "Doesn't it?" Mrs. Dunlap fixed her with a stern look. "You think his unhappiness serves some noble purpose? You think your misery makes the situation respectable? Love in this world is rare as pearls, girl. Most of us live and die without finding it. And when it finds you, especially when you've had no reason to expect it, you take it. You don't throw it back as if it's poison." In January, Adrian received a letter from his solicitor in London. His financial affairs had been reviewed, and there was a matter of some significance requiring his attention. He departed for town with promises to return within a fortnight, leaving Margaret in a state of anxious uncertainty. She told herself that he would return, that nothing fundamental had changed, but the old fears resurfaced. This was too good. This was impossible. It would end. 3 weeks passed before she heard the sound of a carriage coming up the drive. She was in the kitchen, preparing the evening meal, when Adrian's voice carried through the house, speaking to the butler with unusual urgency. She heard footsteps, then a commotion in the hall, and then Adrian was in the kitchen doorway, and she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself because his expression was wild with purpose. "Everyone out," he said to the other kitchen staff, not unkindly, but with absolute authority. They filed out without question, sensing that something momentous had occurred. "I've been to London," Adrian said, and his voice was shaking. "I've settled some matters, made some decisions. I've arranged for your father to have a pension, to live with dignity in his remaining years. I've written letters to every family of standing I know, explaining the circumstances of his conviction, suggesting that perhaps his punishment has been sufficient. I've done what I should have done 5 years ago, and I can never make that right, but I am trying. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but she couldn't speak. Adrian reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. He opened it to reveal a ring. Not a grand thing, not a jeweled statement of wealth and status, but a simple band of gold with a single pearl set into it. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "Not in secret, not as some shameful arrangement. Openly, legally, with every witness the church can gather. I'm asking you to be my wife, and I'm asking you to marry me knowing that I can offer you neither social position nor the approval of anyone of consequence. I can offer you love, and a life built on something real instead of something built on illusions. I can offer you a man who will spend the rest of his days trying to be worthy of you." Margaret's voice, when she found it, was barely a whisper. "The gossip will be extraordinary." "Let them gossip," Adrian said fiercely. "Let them discuss it in every drawing room from London to Edinburgh. I don't care. The only opinion that matters is yours." She nodded, because speaking was beyond her, and he slipped the ring onto her trembling finger. They were married in the village church on a clear February morning, witnessed by the Earl of Worthington and his sister Lady Sophia, by the entire household staff of Ashford Estate, and by most of the village of Thornfield, who came out of sheer curiosity and remained for the sake of genuine pleasure at the match. The vicar performed the ceremony with visible disapproval that somehow only made the thing feel more romantic. The wedding breakfast was held in the great hall of Ashford Estate, and it was humble by the standards of such events. Good food and good wine, but nothing extravagant or ostentatious. Adrian had insisted on it. He wanted no grandeur, no facade of respectability, nothing to suggest that they were trying to cover their tracks or make something scandalous appear proper. Instead, the day itself became a statement. This marriage was real, it was honest, and it needed no artifice to justify its existence. As the weeks turned into months, something unexpected began to happen. The scandal did not fade, exactly, but it transformed. In the way of small communities, the initial shock gave way to familiarity, and familiarity gave way to something approaching approval. Adrian's kindness to the village, his genuine interest in the welfare of the estate's workers and their families, began to earn him a reputation that had nothing to do with his title and everything to do with his character. Margaret's grace and her quiet competence began to earn her respect in a way that her former position had never allowed. The Earl of Worthington began to frequent the estate regularly, bringing his sister and eventually bringing the Earl's own bride, who had been won over by his assurances that Adrian was not, in fact, mad, merely in love. Through this connection, other members of the ton began to accept the marriage, not out of approval for its unconventional nature, but out of genuine liking for the people involved. By autumn, a year after the night Margaret had encountered Adrian searching the servants' quarters, Ashford Estate had become a haven for those seeking intellectual conversation and genuine warmth. It was not fashionable, not in the way that mattered to society's arbiters of taste, but it was valued. It was real. One evening, as Margaret sat in the library beside her husband, reading while he worked through correspondence, Adrian set down his pen and reached for her hand. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Any of it? The scandal, the loss of social standing?" Margaret set down her book and considered the question seriously. 5 years ago, she had been a girl marked by shame, invisible and diminished. Now she was a woman with a name, a purpose, and a love that had been earned through honesty rather than given through obligation. "Not for a moment," she said, and meant it with her entire being. Adrian raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, and through the library windows, the autumn stars began to appear in the darkening sky, bearing witness to a love that had been forged not in the drawing rooms of London, but in the kitchens and gardens of a house where two damaged souls had found each other and learned to heal. Together, they had proven that a person's worth was not determined by their station, and that sometimes the greatest prizes in life were not the ones society recognized, but the ones earned through honesty, kindness, and the courage to love despite the cost. ND